But I'm not going to talk about native script today. I'm going to be talking about Vue and Vuex. So how many here have tried Vue at all? How many like it? Oh, good. Same set of hands. Promising. How many have tried something else like React or Angular? How many like it? Interesting. Okay. Well, I'm not here to persuade you. I'm just here to give you another set of tools. And as with all the frameworks, I try not to be religious because I use React, Angular, and Vue.js. And I kind of find it neat and nice. And I think everyone should be allowed to use whatever they feel like, right? Based on the team they're in or, you know, time of day or whatever reason. My name is Chris Noring. I'm a Google developer expert. I recently joined Microsoft as a cloud developer advocate. I'm trying to find out what that means. My Twitter is at Chris_Noring. I will publish the slides there, but they will also be sent out by the conference, so you can watch the pictures again. I think those are probably the fun parts. Let's talk about motivation. Let's talk about why we're sitting here. I think you know that Vue.js is a thing that you've heard about for quite some time. It's quite popular. On GitHub, it has as many stars or even more than React. So this was a few months old. If I remember correctly, I think it has even more or even more than React. So it's very impressive. Of course, GitHub stars aren't everything, but it's a measurement of, you know, popularity from the developer crowd. And, well, that's you, right? As you can see, we got Angular and AngularJS as a, well, runners-up, I guess. My personal belief is that Vue.js is very popular because it reminds you of something, right? It kind of reminds you of the old days of AngularJS, but it also comes with a really great documentation. Have you guys seen it? I mean, I spend a lot of time in that documentation. I find it so good, and I'm very impressed that it's a fairly new framework, but it's still really well documented. So the interest is there. How many use Vue.js in production? Yeah, that's not as many hands as there are interested people that have tried Vue.js, and I think it deserves more adaption. It deserves to be more in production than it is, I think. Okay, so let's talk about the Vue basics. A lot of you have tried it, but for the other ones, humor me. So let's start with the DOM. Oh, sorry. With any framework, one of the big things nowadays is usually that you need some kind of bundler or some kind of other external Node.js-based tool to make sure that you can bundle up your application and you want to get started and you get stuck using Webpack or whatever you're using and you kind of get tired before you have even started, right? For that reason, it's quite simple to start with Vue.js because you can just have this Vue.js script tag and you can just output some data and you got an application that's up and running. So I kind of like that bit. It's very beginner friendly. So imagine here that we're using these double braces to just output data. We have our script tag and something that reloads every time we do save. Now creating our Vue app is as simple as instantiating the Vue object, tell it what element to aim for that it's going to replace in the markup, and also to provide it with this data property containing message and other message. So by giving it this little, also with the HTML markup, we're going to end up with an application. Doesn't look like much, right? I don't think you get that image, but you get what I mean, right? All right. So what did we do? I mean, there's not a lot of code here, but we instantiated an app component by instantiating the Vue object. We gave it an object definition, and we used interpolation to show our data. And yeah, of course, it gets more complicated from this point on, but I think it's important to have a very nice and easy beginning because it builds confidence, right? So how do we render a thing like a list, right? Because we're used to rendering all types of primitives. It's strings, it's numbers, it's booleans, but it's also complicated things like lists and objects. So for that, we have a structural directive that we call v_for. I'm not sure whether that... Sorry, guys, 1 second. Yeah, I definitely need to charge my computer. This is going to end bad. 1 sec. You know when you get that tone on your computer that it's powering down, and you're like, uh-oh, 5 minutes left. And we're back in action with confidence. All right. So here we have v4 that we use. So we can add a list to our data property by doing so. So here we have the data, and before we had this message, but now we extend it with the items, and the items is a very simple list. And we're able to output what we need like this, just a v4 item in items, and off it goes. So how do we do conditional rendering? How do we render based on a Boolean being true or false? Well, for that we got something called VIF and VELSE. Or with it or else it, how you choose to pronunciate it. So conditional rendering in the markup is as simple as doing the VIF. If this is true, this is what we're going to output, and VELSE simply says everything is good here in this case because the truth condition here is has error. So form controls. There is no application that doesn't have a form control, right? We need to collect data somehow, and eventually I'll tell you how to validate that data to make sure that your database ends up in a nice state. So input element. That's as simple as using the input, and we're using something called vModel, which is essentially a double binding. So in your markup, you're able to define this data property and this new item, and you bind to it. So regardless of whether you change this on the code side or the Vue side, it's going to be in synchronization. Checkbox element. Checkbox element is almost as simple as the normal input. We still have a vModel, and works the same way. And you can also bind to a list of checkboxes, to an array. And that's pretty cool. So we can define an array inside of our JavaScript code. We can set up X number of checkboxes. And for every check we do, this array is going to be added to or removed from, depending if we're checking or unchecking. And of course, we can do the very same thing with a radio button list. But, I have a theme to my presentation. I think you might have seen it in the beginning, but there's going to be more of it, I promise. So here we have a radio button list, and as you can see, we're binding this to a list as well. And for a select list, we can again do the vModel, but we put the vModel on the top, on the select, and all the other options can easily be repeated out with the v4. This is quite basic, right? But if you've never seen it before, it's kind of good. So what about methods? Methods is as simple as extending our object here with a methods property and define X number of methods that we allow it to use. And inside one of these methods, we can refer to our this context, which is essentially, our object that contains different things. So when it says this new item, what it's really saying is this.data.new item, right? But it's a shorthand, so you don't have to type the whole thing. And of course, invoking one of these methods is done by calling the von::click, as you can see down here. So this is how we invoke events and put a method in its place. Okay, so now we know some basics, right? We know how to deal with lists. We don't know how to deal with booleans and a lot of other type of primitives. There are more to Vue than this, of course, but it's kind of good. And this is probably where we spend our first week or two just trying Vue out and see that it feels nice, right? There are more things. Components. I don't think it's possible to use a framework today without using components. If you're using React, you're using components. If you're using Angular 2, you're using components. Vue.js is no different. Even AngularJS uses components nowadays. So Vue component is as simple as providing a component name and an object definition. This is what you get when you try to define a component. And of course, a component needs some kind of template, some markup that says, this is what I look like, but it also needs data property. And at the end of the day, this data property needs to return an object with all your properties that it exposes. But it also has a methods property, which contains all of your methods. So in this case, it's as simple as us trying to input the name of a product, we hit the button and it's calling the save, and the save calls our API, and this thing gets stored. So this is an example of how you can use it. Okay. There's never going to be one component in an application. There's going to be a tree of components, or even a sea of components, if you feel like calling it that. So components is likely to have a child component. That child component is likely to have another child. I think it's called the Matrushka model, if you're any Russians here? All right, you know what I mean, right? Component within the component, yeah, and so on. Recursive definition. So here we have a Vue component, a parent. The parent contains a child component, and as you can see here below, we have a child component that's very simple. It's just outputting the name child. But you can see that we can readily use the child component within the parent component. So this is simple if we're doing this global definition of components that we're doing, but there are other ways of defining components, which is using the CLI. That looks a bit different, but I'm going to show that too. So using the Vue CLI, of all of you who have tried Vue, who have tried the Vue CLI? How many have tried it the simpler way with just a script tag? And the rest of you, I don't know what you did. Okay. So general rule here when defining components inside of Vue, you got one file, one component. That's going to make it really nice and easy to discern. So with components, they usually have a template tag, a script tag, and a style tag. So those are the three main parts that it consists of. So it can look like this. So we start with this template tag, which is our template, our UI. We got the script tag where it exports a default, which is our component definition that we normally input in this component method. And lastly, it has this style, and the style has usually this attribute called scoped. And that means something. That means that we are in isolation when we define styles, which is very nice. If we don't have that, well, you know what can happen with styles, right? They can override each other, and you got a mess, and who did it, right? So we don't have any CSS leakage if we are using this scoped attribute. So child components. As I said before, when I defined the parent component and the child component, it all looked simple, right? I could put the child component in the parent, everybody was happy. There's a bit more to it when you're using the CLI, but not a lot more. So 2 steps you need to take to be able to use child components within any components is to first import a child component, then you need to register it with the parent and say, you actually know what this is. So if I tell you what this is, do you promise to render this? And the parent says yes. So here we have a parent component, and it says, first off, it says import test being the child component, and we go to this components property, and it says, now you know what this is, and now it's your job to render this. So 2 steps. Yes? I believe, let's see here. Oh, so you mean like we have a name collision or something like that, or? I mean, to be honest, I haven't given that much thought to that exact scenario, but I mean, I imagine that you're just importing the correct one instead, right? I mean, yeah. I think I have to owe you the answer, but good question. Okay, so we are free to use this child component inside of our parent, and well, everything is fine at this point. So the test here being the child component, we just use it in the template like so. So what about component input and output? I mean, if we just have components like this, we're just showing static data and they are not really useful, right? Because, well, in a component, you need the way to input data, and you also need a way for the component to invoke methods, right? To send events up. So input and output is as simple as defining a props. So props means that we have an input. We're saying here's a port in, so you can talk to my component, you can give it some kind of data, and it promises to show this data. And to make that possible, we use the vbind, and here we have the vbind and the item, and the product here is some kind of object that comes from the parent. and the component itself says, thank you very much, I know what this is, so I'm going to do item.name. Input validation. There's actually a possibility that a colleague will use the component that you created, or you might use your own code 6 months later and you don't remember what you did. For that reason, or, well, a multitude of reasons, it's very good to have input validation. So input validation comes out of the box in Vue, and it enables you to validate on different levels. So you can have a very simple validation if you want. For example, you can say that a certain property year here is of type number or is of type string. Now, it will still compile, but it will tell you in the console of your browser that you have a warning. It says, well, you try to bind a number here to a thing that should be a string. You better check this. So make sure that you got the developer tools up and running in your browser so you know about the error. But you can go deeper. You can say type and required. So here we say it's of type string and it needs to be there. So required true. Right? So that's like a second level. And this is of for the title, property title. So we're saying you have a type and you are required. We can also provide a default object. So default object enables the one who uses your component to actually omit this input property at all, right? So there's nothing coming from the person using the component, but you can still say, well, I'm going to try to deal with this anyway. I know you didn't give me anything, but just for the sake of it, I'm going to try to resolve this myself. So what it's saying is, if I don't get this product property, I'm going to have a function that spits out an object, and that object makes it possible for the component to render at all. So in this case, we have a default where we say return an object with a name property, and now our component will do its best inside of its template to actually render this. So component still works. Okay, so far I've shown you all these vbind and von and different things, but there are shorthands that I think most people who use Vue uses. So instead of doing the vbind, we can just do simply :product. Instead of vbind product, we do :product, and that's a lot easier to type, right? Less typing. And yeah, so what I wanted to show you in this validation example is that in the first case, it will be happy because we're providing a product to it. But because we have this default function, it will also be happy here because it's trying to resolve this internally to use our default function. And in both cases, this will render properly. Validate the function. We can be better. We started off by saying we want a certain type. We said the type is required, but there is also a validator function. So if it's a complex type coming in, we can be pretty good here. We can use a regex, or we can just say, okay, I assume you're a number, so I'm going to try to see whether you're within a certain interval. So that's a thing that you could be using as well. So in this little example, let's see what happens. So we start off by age being 11. Our validator function says, I'm okay with anything that's 18 and above. But in this case, we got the product detail with the age. Well, in the first case, it's not going to be happy, right? Because the value is too low, according to our validation function. In the second version, age is 19 and everybody's happy. All right, so what about output? We talked about input so far and how we can supply different things, everything from primitives to objects. But with the output, it's about defining methods that the component can invoke, and there's a parent up here catching this thing. Or we hope there is, right? So let's start with the parent. The parent has a template, it has some kind of data, and it has a method, handle save. So we're going to attach this handle save to the component in this case, and the component that we're going to attach it to is the product detail. So here we're doing like an @save. This is instead of the VOnClick. So this is the shorthand for we're attaching a method to an event. So what we simply want this to do is that when you interact with the product detail component, the user will at some point press a button that will emit some kind of event, and the parent stand ready to capture this event in handle save. And this is done by us associating the save event with the handle save method. Pretty simple stuff, I think, if you used any of these kind of frameworks before. So for the child component, we simply have a product name that we output, but we also have the ability to press a button, and we do $emit. So when we do $emit, we have the ability to raise this save event, and we can also provide it with a payload. So in this case, we're providing it with some data. I think I went out of range with the sound, right? Battery. Okay, I have to use my outdoor voice. Still fine, right? Just one. Yes? You don't. Okay. Okay, louder voice for now. It's fine, right? Great.
Someone in your bed.
Okay, so here we have the case where we do the $emit. That means we're emitting this event, and this means that the parent method will be invoked. So $emit, the name of the event, and the second argument is the payload. Okay, so imagine a scenario where we want to change a product locally and save it when we're done editing. This is a very typical scenario, right? Hello?
You could put it back on.
Yep. Great. We're back. Okay, so imagine a scenario, a very simple scenario, where you start typing, the user starts typing in an input box, and when they're done editing, they press save, and they hope that thing will be stored in the database, right? That's the scenario. Okay, so we start with the parent definition here. We have a product title, and we have a click. So, and we also have a V4. So this means we have a list of products. We have a list of products, and we have the ability to select one of these products in a list that's going to be the target of our editing, right? So we have selected this product, we start editing about, and we press save when we're done. And also we hope that this will be saved somehow, right? So we have a select method that enables us to set this selected product property, and we also have the save method that doesn't do much, but imagine that it's calling the backend and saying, yes, here's your save. That looks pretty simple, right? List followed by a product detail component that gets its save property binded to by this save method. Okay. So here we have the child component, the product detail. So it has this property in, it's called product, and we have this input field, so we're able to edit the title field, and when we're done, we press the button, which means we're invoking the save method. One of the first things we do here is to actually copy the value. So why do we copy the value? Why aren't we just happy of taking the value from the outside in and start editing? Well, the problem with that is the binding, right? So if we don't copy this, it will actually change with the parent as well, right? So it will change directly in the parent list, and this might not be what we want. We might actually want to be disconnected between our editing the detail and being in the list. So we don't want that change to show up in the list until we're done, right? So for that reason, we are taking this product that we get in, we copy it, so we get a very shallow copy of this, and we start editing away, and then we press save. Then we say it, I'm done, this is your new product. All right. We got a sad fellow over here. He's a bit sad because it works when he selects first. First time it works. He has a list, he selects an item, he starts editing, he does a save. Everybody should be happy, but he ain't happy because he does another selection in the list. Anyone knows what the problem is? All right. Problem is we're not watching the changes. We're not watching the changes that happens. So the product detail doesn't actually know about this change. So we need to go into that product detail and say, your input property might actually change. If it changes, you need to be ready. Now something funny happened. Okay. So what we can do here is to use something called a watch property. So the watch property has the ability to actually look at this thing and say, If your input values change, then you need to care about this and do a shallow copy again, and then it can continue. And this means that we have fixed our scenario. We have fixed the scenario where our first selection worked fine, but the second selection was just, didn't work. Yay, right? It's very close to lunch, I'm aware of that. Okay, so we feel kind of ready at this point. We know more about the internals of Vue.js, we know what's going on, we know the basics of the forms. Are there more things to view? Well, yeah. Routing, right? We don't want this single-page application. Well, it is called a SPA, but that doesn't mean it needs to have one component. We need to be able to switch from one component to the another component, and so on. So routing. Routing is about defining a routes array, so we have different routes in which our application can go, but it's also about defining different viewports. And lastly, it's about registering those routes to tell Vue about it. It's quite simple and straightforward process. So imagine that we define a bunch of routes. Here we got a products list route and we got a treasure route. So, I mean, we can make up any kind of route at this point, but these are points in which our application can go. And also we need to tell this Vue router object about this routes array. At some point we need to tell the Vue application about the Vue router as well. So viewports. So viewports is our part of our application that we actually replace. So when we define our single page application, it is the same page and it's just being loaded once, right? But we have a page in our application, it's like a piece of paper that we kind of replace, right? So imagine that we take a white piece of paper and we just, yank out the content and say this part of the content can be replaced, the other parts are static. And those parts are usually the menu or a footer or something else, right? But we have this part of the application that's replaceable. And that part, we define that by the router outlet. So here we have static menu, replaceable router outlet, and static footer. And of course, in a very big application, you can have a lot of router outlets and outlets within outlets, and yeah, you can make this as complicated as you want. So how do we navigate? How do we define a link so that Vue knows how to navigate this properly? Well, we use something called router link, and we give it a URL, and it's kind of happy with that. So what about router parameters, wildcard routing? So far I've shown you very simple routes like /products, but we might actually have /product/ something else. So for example, /product/ 11 or /product/ 404. Well, you know what I mean. So point is though that this is a wildcard, right? This ID. So this ID could be anything, but we still want the product detail component to capture this and, well, render different content, but it's the same type of content. So what can we do to match this? So to make sure that we dig out the 11, we dig out 114 or whatever ID number that we have. We can use this router.params. So params in this case is the router parameters that we have defined, and we're able to read out the value of the ID property by simply doing router.params.id. And in this case, we're just taking a static list of products and try to find that product from that list and showcase that. But besides from router params, we got something called query params, and the difference with query params is that they appear after the question mark. You can use them for different things. One area of usage is to, for example, have a page size or page to be able to traverse a collection and be able to tell the backend that we don't want the full collection, we just want one page, and from that page size should only be like 10 items, for example. So this is your ability to filter a collection. Point is still they exist after the question mark. We can dig those out pretty easily by using route.query and see their value. And yeah, you can send this back. So in this case, we do a call to a method called getProducts, and we imagine that this one goes to the backend and say, I'm going to give you a response from the backend based on these filtering parameters. Okay. We know users, right? Users are not engineers. Users are not developers. They will do weird stuff with your application. And for that reason, it's very good idea to have a catch-all route, because they might actually go into the URL if they know that they're inside of a browser, and they might do strange things. For that reason, make sure that you the last entry of your router list here is a catch-all route that has the ability to show them something nice or some way to recover. And we do this with the /**. So programmatic routing. So far I've shown you the router link, the one we defined in the template, but we can also programmatically go inside of our JS code and navigate. We do that by calling this router push with a URL and X number of arguments that we want, or we can refer to our router entry by its name, because we can give it a name as well. Whichever version you prefer of this. We can have multiple viewports, as I was saying. You can make routing as complicated as you possibly want. So multiple viewports is about saying that for a specific route, I might actually want to change different parts of the page. There might be more than just the centerpiece that I normally change. I might actually want to change the header that contains a menu, or I might want a specific footer for that page. You can do that too, and you can have something called named router views here. So if we give it a name, we can route to it. It's pretty simple. So we have path /products, and we can tell it, well, default should be this one and footer should be this one. So for each route, you can just define different components that responds to this and is able to do it differently. You feel like this right now? Quite a lot of info, right? I promise you will get the slides afterwards, so you'll be able to digest it in your time. I'm just trying to show you everything that's there, because it's quite a lot. We need to learn how to test our application. We love testing, right? Yeah, no. How many test your application? Wow, it's almost like your employer's in the room. All right. But we do test, right? Anyone knows this movie? All right. Okay, so the easiest way to get started with testing Vue is using the Vue CLI, because everything has been set up and you're ready to go. There's a lot of CLIs nowadays that do this. Angular is another one that does it. I believe even React does it as well with its CLI. So the type of testing you can do are two different ones. One being unit testing and the other one being end-to-end testing. And yes, you can use Cypress as well as Nightwatch. There was a Cypress guy in the room last time I talked about this, so yes, you can use Cypress. Okay, so for unit testing, there are different scenarios. Karma, Chai, Jest. Anyone loves Jest? Few? All right. React developers, right? Yep. Not many Angular developers knows about Jest, but it's quite good if you try to use it. Yes. Okay, so how do we construct a unit test? There are some steps we need to take. So we need to get a constructor reference. We need to instantiate that constructor. We need to call mount. Once we've called mount, we can find the element that we want, and then we can assert. Okay, this is an interesting description. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about surface testing. All right? So in this case, I'm not testing the internals of the component, but rather what happens if, does it render the way it should? Am I seeing on initial rendering what I should? If I press a button, does it change the way I think? Because we live in a world where we refactor a lot, right? A lot of these testing frameworks being created recently is not focused on testing the internals of the component, because that might change at any point, but testing the external surface. So let's look at a test. So here we have a test component that we get a constructor reference to. We call mount on that thing, and once we have called mount, we are ready to find the element inside of this. So we call the query selector, and we are able to see that, okay, do I have a headline that says testing? This is surface testing. This is not testing the internals. Okay, so imagine that we have a scenario with a component that has input properties. It's quite likely that you have such a component. Your component at this point is pretty simple. It's called about. It has a data with a message property, and it has an input property title inside of it, right? So how do we test this? Well, we get our constructor reference, but inside of our constructor reference here, when we try to call mount and instantiating the constructor itself, we give it a props data which represents our input properties. So we're able to test our components and the fact that we give it input properties. So once we give it input properties, we can just say, okay, let's test if this input property is actually being populated in the correct way in the template. Do we see in the template what we expect to see? So how do we deal with events? Well, with events, we have first the methods, and we have a change property, and this change property tries to set a property, and lucky for us, this message property is actually visible inside of the template. So we are able to use this kind of manner of testing. If we were to set some internal private property that wasn't visible externally, it would be a very hard test to do, right? So how do we test this? Very similar to the other tests. We get our constructor reference, we instantiate it, and we call mount on it, and we try to get a reference to our button. Now, to be able to do the click event, we need to do some plumbing here. We need to call window event to get the click event, and we need to call something called dispatch event, and with the click event as an input parameter. So that's kicking off the event, right? So we kick off the click event, us clicking the button. Once we've done so, we can make sure that the UI has changed the way we think it has changed. Okay, so Nightwatch, end-to-end testing. It's a very simple test, end-to-end testing in this case. It's, I think, the exact same thing as I was doing with the other framework. And yeah, we're trying to assert that something shows clicked. It's a bit different syntax, but essentially what you're saying is I want to go to a certain URL with a certain port. I want to verify that a certain element is present. If it's present and it contains a certain text, then all happy days, right? So as you can see here, there are a lot of utility functions that says look for an element, look for the content of that element, and assert on it, and even do a click. So this looks a bit more maybe straightforward than the other unit test, but it's doing pretty much the same thing. So imagine this scenario. We take our test component, we write some input to it like we did with the unit test, and we assert that the component shows the data in question. That's as simple as saying, let's go to a certain URL, let's look for the app property when it exists and have some kind of timeout to it, because if it takes too long, something is obviously wrong. We look for the element, we try to set the value inside of an input box. We try to, after that, assert that our component contains what we think it should. We have the ability to use all these utility methods to interact with the different form controls and assert on the end result. Okay. There's a lot to be said about testing. I have just scratched the surface here, but I've shown you different ways of doing testing. One of the best books in my mind is this one by Ed, Vue.js Applications Testing. Have anyone tried to read this? How do you like it?
It's good. I haven't read that much. I'm waiting for the hard stuff. I like it more than you.
I'll tell Ed you're waiting. So he lives in London, so I can poke him in the ribs. Yeah. All right. So we are very excited about testing, right? Nah, not that much. I get it. This is probably you at this point. Okay, so state management. You're probably here for VueX, some of you, right? Vue is interesting, but we have these problems nowadays with data, is that the state is being spread out all over the place, right? You got some state here, some state there. You try to do a save, and suddenly this one that should contain the same kind of information doesn't. And you have a problem. All of us today are thinking, well, single source of truth is a good thing. And how do I manage this? Yes, I can build some kind of application service that contains this global object, but you still have the ability that some very trigger-happy developer is going to go into that thing and mess it up anyway, right? So you need some kind of guard, something that says, my global object, there are only a few of these constructs that will be allowed to change it, right? So it's not only about single source, it's about protecting the single source. For that reason, Redux exists. For that reason, Vuex exists, and even NGRX in Angular. Is anyone old enough to know what game this is? I know it's not Fortnite, right? Okay, So let's talk about the store here. I said that the store is something as simple as a global object, which it is if you look at the internals, right? But it comes booted with a bit of utility functions that will guard it and manage the data flow. So again, if you just want to test something and you don't want to use the Vue CLI, you can just add a script tag and you're up and running with your application, with Vue and with Vuex. So instantiating the store. We give this store a global object, right? We tell it, here's a state property, and you should have the property count inside of you. So at this point, the only global state that we know about is count, and it has the default value 0. Very simple. Once we have that, we want to read from it. So how do we read from it? How do we display this in the template? We display it by setting up a so-called computed property, which is nothing more than a function that exposes this from the store. Once we've done that, we can just show this property with interpolation. Sorry. So here we have a simple Vue application. We have a computed property, and we have something called count here. So count is our computed property, and that thing is a function that ends up exposing this count value from the store. So now we're able to actually show this to the outside world. Like so. It's not magic, right? So once you have that computed property, you're kind of good. What about changing this? Well, there are different ways of changing the state in the store. One such version is to use something called mutations. So mutations is a property inside of our store that enables us to define different functions. And these functions have the ability to say, well, I'm going to mutate the state somehow. I'm going to increase a count, or I'm going to decrease it, or depending on what I'm trying to do, right? I mean, it really will do. So this is code that you write, right? So if you got something more complicated than an object or a list, this is where you do your changes. So how do we call these mutations? How do we ensure that we actually do something? Well, here we have a application or a component, and what we need to do is to call the commit. So this will call the functions inside of our mutations property. It's pretty simple. So count is a very simple property inside of the state, right? So it doesn't need a payload, but we can definitely give it a payload as well. So in this case, we're just saying, call this function, and this function is going to do the mutation. But we can also call commit. Okay. With a payload, as I was saying. I mean, if you don't have a count property, you might have a product property or a list property or something, right? At that point, you actually want to tell it, this is the data that needs to go inside of there, and, you know, do what's necessary to merge that change with the existing state. So how do we access the payload inside of the store? Well, here we have an add product method. It takes the state, and it also takes the payload. So here you have the ability to either do a push on it or try to do like an immutable change to it. It's, you know, really what you feel like doing. We got something called actions as well, because we got different ways of doing things. So actions does not mutate state. They call commit when they're done. And the reason for them existing is, the way I read it at least, is that they're supposed to be used in asynchronous scenarios when you can't call commit straight away. It might actually take 3, 5, 10 seconds before you're actually done with that thing that you're doing. And at that point, you want to call commit. So they can be asynchronous. But instead of calling .commit, we will invoke these actions by calling dispatch. So there are like 2 levels here. So let's start with the definition, and you will see what I mean by 2 levels. So we have our store. We have our mutations. We know what those are. They're going to change the state. But here we also have our actions. And the actions here is just simply a method that when it's done with whatever it's doing, it's calling commit, right? So if you're hitting this one first, you have to make sure that you're hitting that one. Otherwise, your state won't be changed, right? And yes, us calling context commit with an input argument. This input argument is the name of the function up there in mutations. So calling an action from a component is as simple as, well, doing this. So store dispatch will fire off this action. The action will call the mutation, and the state will change. This is not really showing the async scenario, so I'm coming to that. Asynchronous scenario. So a very common asynchronous scenario is, for example, that you set the state, the loading state to true because you want to show some spinner in your application. You fetch the data you need, and when you're done with that, you set that data inside of the store, or you set an error property. I mean, those are the different states that you have. So here we have an action. We call load products. We are trying to get products from a backend. When we're done with setting it to the products property to products, but in this case, we're not actually setting it, right? Because what we're doing here is calling the action. That's calling the... sorry, I'm going to restart that one. I'm confusing you. I'm inside of an action, right? So the component has already called this load products function for us by calling dispatch. We are calling dispatch. That's why we're in here. We are calling the mutation now at this point, right? With its data, and that data is going to be set inside of the store. Less confused? All right, so 2 steps, right, to actually change the state. And as you can see here, we're going to let it take any time it takes, right? Because we're using this async await scenario where, you know, it might take 5 or 10 seconds for it to return. So our state can be overcrowded. Yes, it's a global object, and an application that only consists of global data is a very big application after a while. So for that reason, it's good to kind of slice up the state. So for that, we have something called store modules. It enables you to take that big global state and just slice it in smaller bits. So we're going from having in the state in one store to having many stores. So here we have the main store, or the global store, right? And we have some sub-stores here, or sub-modules called module A and module B. So you can just have dedicated ones, right? So imagine that you have like a user store or a product store or whatever store you have, right? Because you have a lot of states inside of there as well. So we define a store module just like we would a normal store, and we simply do this, right? We have the state property, we have X number of mutations, we might even have actions in there. All right, that was a lot of Vue.js, right?